Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Vissa with Adam Schrader. Today we've got a great show for you with Dr. Nicholas Bloom. He's the William D. Eberle Professor of Economics at Stanford University, and he's the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and right now, probably the work-from-home economist. If that's what I would give him a nickname, it would be the work-from-home economist. So, Dr. Bloom, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Thanks very much for having me. And thanks for the work from home economist description. I'm very happy. I'll take that. Thanks.
Yeah, it seems like whenever I read an article about work from home economics or the future of work from home, you're quoted in the article. You're there somewhere. So
yeah, as a professor, before the pandemic, I used to do media here and there. You maybe talk to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the BBC maybe once a month or something. But like during the pandemic, it's just gone crazy precisely because of working from home. It's like there's a whole set of journalists now I just regularly talk to whenever they want data on working from home. And actually so come through the podcast, a lot of CEOs, managers, even our local city council here I spoke to last week about the impact of working from home on the local and U.S. economy.
Yeah, well, I think this is going to be a relatively long interview because there's just so much that I want to touch on, so much that's relevant to your backyard. You're at Stanford, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area, Palo Alto, Silicon Valley. A lot going on in California that affects work from home and just the general economy. But before we get into the nitty gritty, just reading your bio, I'd like for you to clarify, because I'm curious. I hear all the time about the Stanford Hoover Institution, which is, I believe, an economic think tank. You are a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. What's the difference between the two? Is there any collaboration between the two?
A bit. The SIEPR, which I'm associated with, is apolitical, has both Democrats and Republicans. Hoover is famously Republican. So just to explain, with U.S. presidents, after they step down, they get this presidential library. And Herbert Hoover decided his presidential library would be on Stanford campus, and that basically turned into the Hoover Institution. So it's conservative. I would say mostly it's mainstream conservative, but under the current administration, it's got into hot water for a couple of the more outspoken members, certainly people I don't personally agree with. But, most of its members are pretty mainstream. And, most universities are somewhat liberal leaning. So personally, I think it's good for Stanford to have a mix of opinions.
I agree.
I'm not going to go into my politics. They're reasonably centrist, but, I like a range of opinions. And I personally think it's good to have left and right on campus.
That's good to hear. Good to hear. So now talking about the work from home economy, we actually interviewed the chief economist for the Trump administration. He was a chief economist, and I was actually kind of surprised at what he said about the work from home economy. He said that it's temporary, and in 2 years, everyone's just going to go back to how things were before, which I don't necessarily agree, and I could be wrong. What do you think about the future of the work from home economy? Is it permanent?
Well, okay, so one way you can do it is you can ask lots of people what they think and base it off anecdotes. I think my view is backed by survey data. So just to explain where I'm coming from, we've been surveying 2,500 Americans aged 20 to 64 that earned $20,000 last year. So people who basically should be working this year, a month since March. And I have a separate survey of the Atlanta Fed in Chicago serving around 1,000 firms. And my day job is like talking to endless CEOs, execs, run exec training, talking, a lot of this is international, actually, I talked to different institutions, hospitals, healthcare bodies, schools, the universities about working from home. And I have to say, that is just not the picture I get. So I'd say there is a pretty mainstream consensus right now, which is, to explain it, there are about half the US workforce that can work from home. So these tend to be higher skilled graduate jobs, not entirely, but a lot of professionals, managers, lawyers, etc. And then around half the US population that can't work from home. So these tend to be lower paid jobs, like working in shops and factories, but not entirely. Think of dentists and airline pilots. So the second half are never going to work from home. They never have, they never will. The first half, before the pandemic, pretty rarely worked from home. Right now, they're pretty much all working from home. Post-pandemic, the story you hear over and over again is they're probably going to come back into the office about 3 days a week and stay working from home something like 2 days a week. So working from home is not going to stick fully, but we're going to see post-pandemic something like 20 to 25% of working days in America are at home versus pre-pandemic, it was about 5%. So there is going to be a 5-fold increase in working from home. And so that's definitely going to stick. I would bet money on this. If anyone wants to email me with, probably that's illegal, but, I should say I'd be happy to bet. I just heard this from so many CEOs. It's not just my data. If you just look in the media, all the tech CEOs and all the banks, Rite Aid, a big high street pharmacist, they've all said the same thing. So I'm kind of amazed that anyone else would say anything else, unless it was for some, I don't know, unless either their data is wrong or they've spoken to 3 people or there's some weird political motivation. I don't know which one of it is.
Now, do you think that 2 days a week at home is a starting point, or do you think that's kind of the end point?
No, I think it's the end. So just to go through. So, honestly, since I've been talking to like 3-4 execs a week, and this has been going on for like 10 months, you can imagine how many people I've spoken to now. But, here's the standard story you hear over and over again, which is, on the one hand, it's very clear employees like to work from home. So mostly don't want to work from home 5 days a week. The typical employee wants to work from home 2 to 3 days a week. And that would be me. I love seeing my colleagues, but I quite like to work from home for a couple of days a week to kind of get my quiet time in. And then if you look at firms, they say, well, look, we need people on the business premises, probably something like 3 days a week, to aid in innovation. They say you need to see face-to-face contact to be innovative. That's the famous Steve Jobs quote. B, for company culture, loyalty, motivation, the kind of softer side of things. And then C, there's issues around employee mental health. So those factors mean that CEOs really want to see people on business sites about 3 days a week. And so what I've heard over and over again is firms are saying, hey, look, we're going to have a model whereby everyone's going to come into the office, say Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. All our meetings, all our client meetings, our training events, our presentation, leaving dues, lunches are going to be on those days. And let's say Wednesday, Friday are going to be the days when people work from home. And the CEO downwards is going to do that to make sure, no one sneaks back in thinking they're getting advantage. And as long as we all stick to that plan, and you can imagine in bigger organizations maybe have red teams and green teams, and they rotate between Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Wednesday, Friday the week after. That seems to work well, and it seems to be a win-win. So there's lots of evidence firms are more productive if employees work from home about 2 days a week, because employees can concentrate on those 2 days, and employees are dramatically happier and therefore more likely to stick and be, not leave the firm. And implicitly, it's a kind of a free perk if they get to work from home 2 days a week.
Dr. Bloom, I want to set some context because you come from Silicon Valley. You're at Stanford. I used to work in Silicon Valley. I lived in Silicon Valley. And to me, that area, that entire San Francisco Bay Area, it's like another country. It's not the same as the rest of the United States. It's not even the same as Los Angeles. And living in Florida, having lived in, I think, 6 or 7 different states, it's a very different culture over there. There's a lot of money in these companies and these startups. There's a lot of fundraising. There's a lot of venture capital. And so these companies are able to have these huge, big offices. They're able to have these ridiculous happy hours with thousands of employees and open bars and buffets every week. This is not your typical small business in Florida or Texas or Illinois. And I wonder, because what you just said, come into the office 3 days a week and work from home 2 days a week, and we'll have this lunch and that meeting and this company outing. That's not really how it works for most stuff. I'm a business owner, and that's not how my company works. So kind of what do you have to say about Silicon Valley and your research and applying it to the rest of the country and the world?
So great point. That's why I think you need to do research and not just rely on anecdotes. So our survey data, we've spoken to 20,000 people right now, is representative of the US. So I don't know, probably it's hard to know what share of people I speak to in the survey. Well, we collect survey data from Silicon Valley, maybe 3-4%. I mean, whatever the share of the working population is. So if you look, I have an underlying paper. If you look at the data, the biggest state is California. That's because it's the biggest state in America, but the second biggest is Texas, and the third is New York, etc. So you're exactly right. And actually, it's why the comment from the White House chief economist, I think, is in some ways is misleading. I suspect it's from someone that's spoken to maybe a couple of dozen business leaders. If you want to know what's happening on average for the US, you have to ask everyone. You can't just speak to people in Silicon Valley as much as you can't just speak to people in Florida. So which is why we set up a national survey. One of the joys about lockdown, one of the unusual things, I mean, generally it's pretty awful, but is all the meetings are now on Zoom. So when I talk to people, it doesn't matter whether they're down the road on the East Coast. So the folks I've been talking to through exec ed and through consulting, there's no more of them, particularly in Silicon Valley, than there are in New York or Texas or Florida. It is true, though, it's worth noting there is a big city versus rural divide. And it's not so much about politics or anything else. It's about the types of jobs. So in our data, if you look at large city jobs, which would be San Francisco, New York, Chicago, LA, Atlanta, Dallas, etc., they are much more likely to be professional services, finance, high tech, business services. And those are the kind of graduate jobs that can be more easily done working from home. I mean, there's a reason, if you think about it, they're in an office. So pretty much most activities that go in an office don't require heavy equipment. They generally don't require to meet huge numbers of customers. And therefore, it's typically feasible to have them working from home for, let's say, 2 or 3 days a week. So, no, you're entirely right. If you only spoke to people in Silicon Valley, that would be crazy. But that's not remotely what I do. And you can hear I'm British. It's not even I'm from here. I'm from London. So I don't know which one of us has lived in Silicon Valley more, but it's certainly not the case that I grew up here.
So when it comes to your discussions with the business leaders, they're talking about having their people work from home 2, maybe 3 days a week, or 5 out of every 10 days. Are they talking about reducing their office footprint when they're doing that, or because they're going to have people in there half the time and kind of cycle through their people, maybe half are on this kind of off shifts or whatever? Are they not talking about reducing their office footprint?
Great question. So just to explain, by the way, why are they talking about having people work from home 2 days a week? It's because it's going to, it's a business decision. It maximizes profits. So just to explain, to recap on earlier, firms seem more productive. And in our surveys, employees say they'd value getting to work from home 2 to 3 days a week post-pandemic, about 8 to 10% of wages. So if you can give employees something that's free or close to free, but they value 8 to 10% of wages, why wouldn't you do it? It's kind of like, having a free pension system or a free healthcare plan. So that's what's driving it. It's purely a business decision. You will make more money if you do this because employees value it and therefore they'll work harder and less likely to quit. Then on office space, so we ran a big survey with the Atlanta Fed on this, and we polled around 1,000 firms again across the US and asked them their plans. And it turns out US firms on average predict post-pandemic to have about an equal amount of office space. So initially that seems really surprising. You're like, how can that be the case? You've just told me that number of days working from home is going to go up from 5 to 25%. That means there's 20% more days at home and therefore 20% less days in the office. And the reason is that social distancing is also not going to completely go away. So business after business have said, things like I've seen, or my employees have seen far too many of those sneeze videos to ever want to go back into that cramped and packed conditions I had before. So honestly, we're going to have to give them a bit more space per person. And so it looks like on average, US businesses are seeing something like 20% less footfall, but something like 20% more space per person. So overall, space is about flat. The really striking thing is there's a massive shift out of skyscrapers into lower density buildings. So skyscrapers are basically like cursed buildings because under the pandemic and to some extent even post-pandemic with fears of being close to people, you can't get there with social distancing. So if you think of New York and San Francisco, which are like, or Washington, which are some of the worst affected cities, you have to take a subway to get into the, the front door. And then when you're there, you got to take this elevator up to get up to floor 30. And both of them are really tricky. So the demand for office space is about flat, but it's moving from skyscrapers a bit out to the suburbs. So it's what's been called the donut effect. So a lot of major U.S. cities, so the most obviously Washington, D.C., San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Chicago, etc., seeing drop in density right in the center of the central business district around the high rises, but a lot of demand, actually increasing demand for property out in the suburbs where both more people are living and more businesses now want to be located.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting whenever you consider the fact that over the past 20, 30 years, the whole open office concept has become bigger and bigger, and everybody thought that was the new future, and now suddenly the open office is a detriment to everything. So the workspace will be interesting to watch as it progresses.
So here's another. This has come up a lot in terms of office architecture. What's very interesting here is what's correct now is completely different from what would be correct a year from now. So right now, I'm in Santa Clara County and we have almost a complete lockdown, and everyone, locally, but just more generally, you hear across the US, people are putting in perspex screens. They're trying to put people into cubicles. They're trying to make people not physically interact with each other. Whereas post-pandemic, once the vaccine has come and we've moved over our fears, if you're in this 3 days per week in the office and 2 days per week at home, those 3 days a week in the office are now become hyper-social. Basically, all the meetings you would have had spread out over 5 days and presentations and client events are now pushed into 3 days. But as a result, you want the office actually to be set up to be conducive to that. So you want a lot of presentation rooms, a lot of meeting rooms, a lot of bigger rooms, and not much of these old school cubicle offices, because people that want to work quietly just do it on their 2 home days. So I think, from I've talked to 2-3 architects, and I've actually talked to about 4 or 5 commercial property companies as well. There is now, now is a weird period, but post-pandemic, there's going to be a bit more of a move towards more collaborative space. It's not quite the same as massive open plan spaces, but it is much more meeting rooms and less old school cubicle offices, which, closed boxes. Because if you're going to work on your own for 4 hours, why not just shift all that reading stuff to, your day at home? And when you're in the office, basically spend your time with your colleagues.
As a centrist economist, as you said earlier, you also just mentioned that Santa Clara County is trying to control people and tell them where to be, where to go, what not to do. And I just think to myself, how do you not think that you're back in this mythical 1984? And I'm sure the Hoover Institution has talked about this, but that's it. I just keep thinking about 1984 when I read about California, when I hear people like you saying this is what our government officials want us to do.
Well, it's not just California. I mean,
yeah, it's New York, California, Illinois, but I'll tell you, it's not Florida. Florida is the opposite where we are.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've spoken about this before. It depends. Look, it's a trade-off. You go into work and then more people get infected, more people die, but then, economic activity stays high. As an economist, we're comfortable or have been about putting a monetary value on life. There's something called the statistical value of life, which in government figures is typically $2-3 million. So Florida versus California. In Florida, more people would die from the virus infection if you don't have a lockdown, but you'll also have a stronger economic, growth rate and level. And the question is, which do you want? Now, it turns out, as it happens, that I've looked at the data on working from home. I'll pose you a question. In May, there were significantly higher levels of working from home in blue states because they had early levels of infection and faster lockdowns. It turns out, well, it's kind of obvious where I'm heading, but I know from our data by November it's flipped. So red states now have higher levels of working from home. Why? They actually have lighter levels of regulation. It's just that people are too scared to go into work. So I'm not sure how much of a trade-off there is. You notice Sweden has reversed course. In theory, it seems like you let people go into work and, they maybe get infected, but then they generate more economic activity. it looks like now, 8-9 months into the pandemic, that trade-off's a bit of a false myth. In practice, a lot of people are so scared that if infection rates are high, they refuse to go in, whatever they're allowed to do. So, look, I'm not saying it's great. It's kind of, crap or crapper, but it looks like lockdown is probably the better solution even to protect the economy. But this isn't my area of speciality. I personally do want the government to step in if it's going to protect my health and, stop me, my kids, or my parents dying. And it's true, it's politically involved and it's interfering, but that's that we live in that. In the same sense, if my next door neighbor decided to, start collecting radioactive isotopes, it would be invasive of the government to prevent him doing that, but I'd be very happy for them to do that. So there's a trade-off. It's not really this podcast, so I'm gonna move on from this discussion.
Yeah. Well, one thing that is important from an economic perspective that you brought up, and that was the first part of what you said, and that's placing a dollar value. And for whatever reason, look, I took many economics classes. I have multiple business degrees. So I never considered that to be offensive to put a dollar value on life. I own several life insurance policies. And I think when you're making these decisions from an economic perspective, not from a medical perspective, you have to look at the data and the numbers, like what you do. And you're probably the first person I've talked to who brought this up and who was able to give examples of California versus Florida, or red versus blue, for example. And I just think that's it's a way, it's really the only way to navigate economically through this current predicament. Because if we're talking about lives, again, as an economist, we know that death is a part of life. Like, we know that before this year started, and on January 1st, December 31st last year, we knew that close to 2.9 million Americans would die, because something like 2.87 million Americans died last year. And so an economist could predict, okay, regardless of what happens, 2.9 million Americans are going to die. Yeah, it is sad, but that's just part of the, the profession of prediction, and their entire industries and businesses revolving around death. And so I just wanted to state kind of the reality of the situation.
Yep. No, like there are trade-offs. I'm happy to talk about working from home, to pull it back onto that. I don't see any trade-offs at all post-pandemic. It's one of the few win-win things that's going to come out of it. We're going to see roughly a 5-fold increase in working from home. Employees are dramatically happy with that, and businesses will be more profitable. I got into this just to set the scene. About 10 years ago, I had a student out at Stanford as well. This is very Stanford unusual, who is called James Liang, who founded a massive travel agency in China. At the point at which he was my student in Stanford, he'd stepped back to be their chairman, which had like 15,000 employees, was worth 5-10 billion on NASDAQ. So, this person in my class was extremely wealthy, and they wanted to experiment with working from home out in Shanghai. So he ran what's called a randomized control trial. We asked 1,000 people in their Shanghai office who wanted to work from home. 500 of them signed up and said they'd like to do it. And the deal was 4 out of 5 days a week. And then we randomized. So they literally drew a ping pong ball out of an urn, and it said even. So people with an even birthday got to work from home for the next 9 months, and people with an odd birthday stayed in the office. And it's exactly the same way you test drugs, to scientifically look at the causal effect of working from home. And what we found is, and we studied them for actually 2 years throughout this process and beyond, that people working from home were 13% more productive. They were 4.5% more productive per minute. And when we had very good data. They were call centers, writing code, taking orders, etc. They said it's quieter. I remember fantastic anecdotes. Like one person said, that my cubicle mate next door to me, she clips her toenails in the office at work, and it's disgusting. It's like so distracting. Or, boyfriend, girlfriend problems, or, World Cup sweepstakes, etc. So they're 4.5% more productive at home because it's quieter. And the other 9% was because they said, we saw in the data, they actually worked more minutes per day. So it turns out home-based employees tend to start very punctually. They take shorter lunch breaks. They take fewer tea and coffee breaks. They take less sick days. So when you add that up, in that experiment for that group, they were significantly more productive working from home. And that's how I got into this literature and seemed surprised until the pandemic so few companies have actually adopted this.
Are you expecting companies like, I believe Google and Facebook have come out and said their employees are never going to have to come back to the office? Do you think they're going to start walking back on that?
Yes, I think so. Look, much as, I don't see myself at either kind of political extreme. I'm free market. When I was in the UK, I voted for Margaret Thatcher. So don't get me wrong. I'm not some kind of, pro-government person. But I also think I kind of pretty moderate on working from home. So I personally don't support, and the data doesn't support, 5 days a week working from home as being particularly productive. So like under COVID, we don't have a choice. Literally, I physically could not go into Stanford campus to work in the office. I'm not allowed to. So I have no choice but to work for 5 days a week. Post-COVID, when there's a vaccine coming out, I will be very surprised if many firms keep that up. So yeah, I'm agreed. I know they have said, in fact, they've been kind of careful if you read what the exact wording. They've made comments like, it will be possible to. From speaking to lots of managers, I haven't spoken directly to Google, but I've spoken to people in Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, just so many of these firms. I mean, I've spoken to firms in, 100, 200 for lots of different industries. It looks like very few of them are planning, honestly, to have full-time working from home post-COVID. There'll be a few employees maybe that will have a pay cut that say you really want to stay in Mississippi or, Alaska. Your manager may say, look, you can remain remote working, but you're going to take a 20% pay cut. And to be honest, your promotion prospects are less good. Some people may accept that, but most people, as in, the vast majority of people, I think, are going to go back into the office 3 days a week. And so, the few outlier firms like Quora that said they're going to be fully remote, I'd be amazed 5 years from now how many of them are left. I think they're just going to struggle to operate fully remote, at least large companies.
Going back to the commercial real estate, retail shopping centers, what's going to happen to them? Because as you established earlier, a lot of these small businesses, not the huge companies, but a lot of these small businesses, it doesn't make sense for them to keep that same lease or have that big office space. So what do you think is going to happen to all that commercial real estate and retail shopping complexes? What will they be turned into? What will they become?
So my best prediction is, let's go through this bit by bit. So start in the center of cities and let's move out from there. So skyscrapers, start at the very center. They're in trouble. So, if anyone listening is long skyscrapers, owns a lot of skyscrapers. Well, first off, you're lucky. These are very expensive buildings, but you're probably a bit less lucky than you were a year ago. So skyscraper valuations are clearly down. The number of people, renting out skyscrapers. And the reason is you just can't fit the same density in post-pandemic as you could before. So right now, their occupancy rates are about 10%. They're clearly going to go up once the vaccine comes out, but I doubt they're going to go up to 100. They may go back to, say, 70% of pre-pandemic. So given I just told you businesses want about the same amount of space, that's now a lot of businesses looking for space that currently, you've taken out of the center of cities. So demand is actually probably going to rise in the suburbs. We also know on the residential side, a lot of people are moving out of city center apartments and moving out to the suburbs. So that's putting a lot of pressure to get actually commercial office space in things like industrial parks or residential areas. Now, one way is just more office space. The other way is going to be some of that, I suspect, will come from repurposed retail that as more demand goes online is going to shut down. So most obviously things like gyms, movie theaters, but maybe some retail outlets that were marginal before the pandemic may be pushed under. And that space is great for an office. If you think about it, you can drive, has plenty of parking. You don't have to use an elevator, so it's very convenient for social distancing, and it's in the shopping mall. I mean, and many offices are very happy to have businesses to have offices in shopping malls. It's quite a nice place to be located. So I don't think commercial property out in the suburbs is at risk at all, actually. I think commercial property in high rises in the center of cities is, but suburban commercial property will either stay at its current use, or if it's, say, gyms, will just change, will be a change of use. And also remember, if office workers are now working in the office 3 days a week and working at home 2 days a week, and many of them live in the suburbs, they're going to be having more lunches and more lunch breaks and more afternoon shopping trips to local suburban retail outlets. So we estimate in a paper that the amount of expenditure in central New York from working from home post-pandemic will be down 10%. But that lost expenditure in central New York and the central business district is not disappearing, it's going somewhere else. So suburban New York may actually see increased expenditure from office workers on their home day that say need to go and buy their husband or wife a present and just pop out to the shops. And rather than go to, Saks Fifth Avenue, they go to their local department store or local shopping mall.
Well, talking about the skyscrapers and, like you said, the movie theaters, well, what happens to them? Do they just get torn down and you build smaller offices or residential single-family homes? Like, what happens to those?
Well, so let's start with the skyscrapers. So there's no, particular problem with the skyscrapers. It's just that rather than have, if previous occupancy was 100%, current occupancy may be 70%. You just have slightly less people coming in and out. Everyone has a bit more space. A bit fewer people use the toilets and the kitchens. These are still very, very valuable buildings. You can imagine 70% of their per value or whatever it is, 80, 90% is still a lot of money. So no one's tearing down skyscrapers. I suspect the number of new skyscrapers being built may drop because obviously they're less valuable and, you have to consider costs and benefits of building a new building, but the current ones are still going to remain used. Interestingly, it's possible some of that space gets converted to residential use. The choke points for skyscrapers is actually the elevators. So to be most clear, the biggest constraints, if you're worried about social distancing, is up in the morning and down in the evening. If you look at, I don't know if anyone's worked in office buildings, but if you're trying to go up in the elevators at 8:30 to 9:30 in the morning, it's really crushed and down. So you could easily find some floors get turned over to, high-end residential apartments that don't tend to crowd the elevators. And then in terms of out in the suburbs, again, if you think of gyms, they're actually really great location for offices. They're mostly gyms, a single story with lots of parking, lots of windows, nice buildings. They're very easy as long as, I actually spoke to our city council last week and was saying one of the things that would be important to do would be flexible on planning permits. So it's easy to say change purpose from a gym to an office. Because of course, depends where you are, but certainly in California, you can't change of use like that requires some kind of planning buff, but there's no reason why you wouldn't want to do it. So I think I'm not negative at all on property. I'm actually positive on commercial and residential property in the suburbs. I'm just negative on commercial property in high-rise buildings in the center of cities. That's the one place I think there's problems.
Now, it could be interesting when it comes to the skyscrapers, if they do try to do full occupancy, but require on their leases that you stagger your hours. So they'll say, you can sign this lease, but you can't open until 10, so your people aren't coming in to the, elevator crush, and they try to stagger it that way. But what is the height of the building that you find kind of starts becoming a problem? Is it just anytime you need an elevator, like, 10 stories, or if people aren't going to walk it, or kind of what's the line that you've seen?
It is kind of 5-6 stories. Look, people may walk up. I mean, interesting enough, here's a big difference between the Europeans and the Americans. 2 stories is like a big walk for Americans. In the UK where I'm from, people would happily walk 3 or 4 stories up. But
I used to walk up to our 16th floor office every once in a while. That wasn't a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I lived in an apartment in central London, and I used to be on the 5th floor, and I had to walk up the stairs, and it was great until we had a baby. And at that point, someone said either she's going to learn to climb stairs very fast or you're moving. And I think we ended up moving. But I'd say, 4 or 5 story buildings, they start to be problematic. You've also got, Americans with Disabilities Act. There's various issues about as they get taller, people are clearly going to have to use elevators. The other point, Adam, I've been pushing, and as an economist, the idea of, it's not so much staggered leases, but kind of resource cost pricing. So just think about this. If you think about airlines, everyone wants to fly on Monday mornings and Friday afternoons. And so airlines, if you look at Southwest, their flight prices are way more expensive than if it's a kind of Wednesday, middle of the day. Similarly with office buildings, if everyone wants to go up in the morning and down in the evening in the lifts, what you need to do is, as a tenant, reduce your rate per square foot, say half the rate per square foot you charge clients, but instead now charge them for swipes in the elevator system in and out the building during choke points. And what you'll discover is some tenants can easily adjust the hours of their employees and others can't. And that way around, you'll have a natural market solution. So, for example, out on the West Coast, you may find that financial firms that want to start really early to catch up with Wall Street, they become very attractive tenants. You'd love to mix them in with other, high-tech firms, because the financial guys, they start work at 6 a.m. and they finish by 2. And if you have a system whereby you swipe people, say $5 to go up between 8:30 and 9:30, you'll discover a lot of firms persuade either start early or start late. So I don't think it's that complicated. Most of these tall buildings now, everyone has to enter and exit with a swipe card. And so actually that's very easy to link up to a central computer system and charge people, much like you charge people for, boarding airlines and moving their seats around.
Dr. Bloom, I want to talk a little bit about the people who don't work from home. So these are the restaurant workers, the kind of rural area folks. And what's going to happen to these individuals? Because it looks like a lot of these industries, a lot of these businesses, I think Yelp came out with a report today saying that it was 50 or 60% of the businesses that are listed on Yelp are not coming back. It was 30%, maybe in mid 2020, but that's gone up. So what happens to these individuals, especially if they don't have the tech skills, if they don't have enough money to pay for good internet, to do stuff from home? What's your prediction?
So yeah, I mean, this is one, when I end the paper, there's one negative note in the paper, and I tell you, just to build on what you said, Naresh, and then just talk about the policy suggestions. It is clear that this pandemic is increasing inequality. So exactly as I mentioned earlier on, half of Americans roughly cannot work from home. They've not only suffered worse during the pandemic, they're more likely to have lost their jobs. So if they keep their jobs, they're going to go in and suffer infection risk. But now it appears that post-pandemic, they're also not going to do as well because they're not going to get this work from home perk. So as I mentioned, this perk appears to be worth something like 10% of earnings. And so, of course, if you can't work from home, you just don't get that. So I think there's a couple of implications. One is all the money we spent on the stimulus, somebody's going to have to pay back. And I suspect one push politically towards putting the taxes up on higher earners is going to be they're the people that tend to be educated and haven't had relatively such a bad pandemic. So taxes for sure are going to have to go up. We've borrowed an enormous amount of money and we've got to pay some of it back. And I think it's reasonable not to tax lower earners as much, since they're the people who generally cannot work from home and so have suffered. The other issue is it is part of trying to promote economic growth. We've seen after the 08-09 recession, that was horrible. We lost a vast number of jobs, particularly low-skilled jobs. By 2019, they're almost all back. So if you look at unemployment rates in 2019, it was at incredibly low figures. So much like the current pandemic, the best solution, honestly, is to promote growth. And, the obvious things is trying to generate stability, reduce regulation, keep taxes low, have good policy. There's no magic bullet here. But growth will tend to fix that issue as best as we can. There isn't, throwing government money isn't great. You've got to, raise that money from somewhere, and I'd rather just keep taxes low. But that is going to be our best bet. It worked in 2010 onwards. It took a while, but by 2015, 2016, the U.S. labor market was pretty good. And in 2019, it was pretty fantastic. Yeah,
you said one thing about paying the money back, and I think Adam might have some thoughts about that because I a little bit subscribe to this policy of modern monetary theory, despite leaning right politically. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about modern monetary theory and basically the idea that we actually don't have to pay back the debts and we can borrow. And then on top of that,
it's not borrowing.
You're saying you could just print more money.
Well, you spend it. We don't borrow dollars from anywhere. That's just a fact. We don't borrow our money. We create it. We don't have to borrow it from China or the taxpayers. Our taxes pay nothing. Our taxes are just pulling money out of the system to give our money value and to reduce the risk of inflation. We're not borrowing it from anywhere.
I'm generally, there's bits in modern monetary theory. I'm broadly not a supporter of it. But look, to be clear,
it gets bastardized in by a lot of politicians. I will concede that incredibly. They use it as an excuse to pay for anything, which is just not true. We can't just spend into oblivion. That is a recipe for inflation.
It is true we can, spend money now and pay back later. Look, so economists say money is a veil. Ultimately, the small green pieces of paper called money don't do anything. We can't eat them. We can't enjoy them. We can't, they don't work. So we should really care about what we call the real side of the economy, what people produce. And printing large numbers of pieces of money, I mean, creating more green pieces of paper doesn't change ultimately anything on the real side. So you could, of course, print, a shed load of money. In the short run, you could pay people with it. Eventually, you're going to discover it produces inflation if you push too much cash out into the system. So yes, in the short run, you can print more money and spend more money. The problem is eventually that comes back to bite you. So, there isn't really any golden solution out there. I kind of in favor of stimulus spending. It's a horrible pandemic. You need to kind of see people through it. But eventually, a chunk of this money we're going to have to pay back because otherwise we're going to be left with huge amounts of debt. Or even worse, lots of pieces of paper floating around, which is going to generate an inflation. And that's pretty miserable. If you're a saver, you really, really don't want inflation. So, I don't want to get off topic too much, but I mean, if you think of running a household, the Americans have the dollar. If they abuse that system, people stop spending it internationally. So, I mean, we can spend a long time discussing it, but ultimately, we have borrowed a lot of debt. American debt to GDP is over 100%. It's higher than the all-time peak beforehand, which was just after World War II. It can go higher. The British borrowed more than 200% of GDP, more than twice that amount, after the Napoleonic Wars about 200 years ago, and they did pay it back. It took them a very long time. The last piece of the Napoleonic War debt was repaid in 2015. So that's like 200 years. So, we will be paying the current debt back for the next 20, 30 years. It won't just be us, it'll be our kids that's paying this stuff back. But we can't keep stimulus spending forever. There's no way we can keep pushing that debt up and up. And the one thing that worries me is what happens is there's another horrible event. I mean, who knows what it is, but, some monster earthquake or hurricane hit some part of the US. It's a complete disaster. We need to spend more money. We're going to discover next time around we have less because we already have so much debt.
Can you talk about the paper that you worked on that talked about what Americans are doing with the time saved with their fewer commuting hours?
Yeah, so it's pretty fascinating. So here's the thought process. There are roughly 160 million working Americans. They commute on average for 1 hour a day, about half an hour each way. We know that working from home went up by kind of zero, more or less, to 40% of days. So there's something like 60 million hours a day that people are not commuting. So we asked, what are they doing with all this time? So in our survey for 2-3 months, each month we asked 2,500 people this. And what came out was roughly 40% of that time is being spent on their main job. So your employer is getting about 40% of that saved commute time. The other 60% is being kept, in a sense, by the employee. And that roughly breaks down into half of that time we would call home production. So it's basically kind of, inverted commas, constructive activity. So it's either a second job, childcare, or kind of home repair and mending things. And the other half is leisure. And it's roughly equally split actually between indoor leisure, a lot of computer and TV time, and outdoor leisure. So, that seems a pretty fair split of time. It's partly why working from home has been productive for firms. Of the hour people save and commute, they're giving back about half of it to their employer. And then why employees are happy too. They're getting an extra, the other half, where actually 60% is going to them.
You brought up earlier, you touched on the Steve Jobs quote and face-to-face in offices, how it spurs creativity, innovation. I actually disagree with that. I've been working from home for a while, full-time since 2013. And talking about this paper that you just referenced, I actually find myself to be most creative when I am alone and listening to podcasts, reading books, just kind of in the shower. So what does your research say about the effects of working from home on innovation and productivity? Well, you already talked about productivity, but how about innovation?
No, it's a great question. And the short answer is not much. So there are two types of research out there. And in fact, Eric Yuan, the CEO of Zoom, I had a discussion with him and he raised exactly this point. So endless CEOs have asked this question actually, which is, I'll give you, there's short run productivity and long run productivity. Short run productivity, I'm going to call doing the same thing over and over again. So that's what we studied in the big project I did out in China 10 years ago, and we have very good data on that because we have a lot of data from also the pandemic where firms rapidly shifted employees home. It looks like short-run productivity is actually up on average. So again, I'm aware that there's lots of variation, and this is kind of why we want to look at data rather than anecdotes. So I'm sure there are people that are down and people that are up a lot, etc. But on average, so, by now I've got 20,000 data points. Short-term productivity working from home looks like it's up something like 8%. Now, that doesn't mean they're more productive per hour. It means that output goes up. And it's important to highlight that point because I just mentioned earlier, they're working slightly more hours. So the typical employee is basically 8% more productive, as in producing more over the day. Some of that is they're more effective per minute. And some of it is honestly, they're working more minutes because they're not commuting and they're not taking as many breaks. So anyway, in the short run, you can call that 8% more productive if you like, or 8% more output. The critical thing, as you asked, Naresh, is the long run. And there the evidence is far thinner just because it's much harder to study it. So what I mentioned earlier and what I've written up is really what we've heard endlessly in anecdote. But the anecdote we've heard of so many execs and increasingly as time has gone on is that it's hard to be fully creative working from home. And again, some people like for you, that may work really well. You may be better. On average, firms feel that their employees are just not as creative at home. And that will be my own personal experience. But me and you are a sample size of 2, so it's hard to infer too much from that. But that's partly why, if you look at large companies, they build very nice offices, is to try and encourage, particularly high-end, high-tech banks, industrials, build nice offices because they want people in the office because they think there's some upside from, people interacting, creativity. The other issue they raise a lot, just from why they want them there, is kind of office culture. Transfer of intangible information. Just to give you one example, a friend of mine, she started a company recently and she started remotely. And she said, it was really hard, despite them sending me this training manual, to know a whole set of basic things. Like, for example, when do you formally start and stop work? Like everyone knows in graduate jobs, you don't really start at 9 and stop at 5. But she said without physically being there, it's hard to see. So I think there are other reasons beyond just innovation that it's useful to be in work, say 3 days a week. I just don't think it's necessary to be in work 5 days a week. I'm also aware there's a variation. So Naresh, for you, it may work being at home for 5 days a week. And for others, they really want to be in work 5 days a week. But the average we hear back is something like 3 in the office, 2 at home.
So looking at, what's going on with our economy and with the companies and everything, what kind of timeline do you think we're looking at before our economy is, before we start really bringing jobs back and kind of getting back to even a semblance of where we were at the beginning of 2020?
The best bet is about 2 to 3 years. So just to give you some rough figures. So the recession has looked like a tick shape. We were down, honestly, about 12% on GDP. We're back up about 6%. So we're now net down about 6%. But over the same period, the economy would have grown by maybe 1 or 2%. So we're down probably 7 or 8%. We're still rebounding, but probably by the end of this year, we may be down kind of 6%. Before the pandemic, and for the prior 10 years, the American economy was growing incredibly steadily at about 2.5% a year. So if we're down 6%, it's going to probably take 2.5 years to get back to where we were at the beginning of 2020. Now, what's slightly depressing is that's going to get back to where we were at the beginning of 2020. If we hadn't have had the pandemic, of course, we'd have had growth over that period. So just to get back to the same level is going to take 2.5 years. And at that point, we're just on a lower trend. So Americans are going to end up being permanently about 5% poorer. So if you think of a line, there's a growth rate, it's rising, and we kind of have a shift downwards, then it continues at the same trend, just about 5% lower. So in a couple of years, 2-3 years, we'll kind of feel back to where we were in 2019. But, unfortunately, we're now on a lower trajectory.
William D. Eberle, professor of economics at Stanford University. You are Dr. Nicholas Bloom, also co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship program at the National Bureau of Economic Research and senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. The website is nbloom.people.stanford.edu, nbloom.people.stanford.edu. Dr. Nicholas Bloom, thanks so much for joining us on the Work From Home Show. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our listeners or anything else you want to promote?
I mean, your show is, your timing is perfect. Work from home is an idea that's been kicking around, but it's had a horribly low adoption rate until the pandemic. And now, it's everywhere. And work from home really is, it's an idea whose time had come 10 years ago. We should have been doing this 10 years ago. By then we had video calls and, cloud and email and broadband and, if there's any upside from the pandemic, is that it's got us to adopt work from home mainstream in a way that we weren't previously doing. So the pandemic has been horrible, but it will have some positive changes. And the mass rollout of work from home is one of those few positive changes.
Dr. Nicholas Bloom, we really appreciate your time. This has been a great interview. We've had several economists on the show. I think you not only are you the most relevant because you're the work from home economist, but it was a fascinating discussion on a variety of topics. So thanks for that. It was entertaining. It was certainly worthwhile. To all our listeners, go to workfromhomeshow.com, get on our mailing list, see all of our previous episodes. We have been doing this show since March of 2020, and the growth has been tremendous. We continue to push out more and more content. So workfromhomeshow.com, subscribe to us on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, leave us reviews there. And until next time, keep on working from home.